Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. So, this is a part of a multi segment series about Palestinian life under occupation in the West Bank. And you can check down below for links to all the other segments as I make them. All of them will be listed down below. But please subscribe, hit the bell. As I roll these out, you will be notified. So, let's go ahead and get started. Now, we're going to talk today about the travel and document situation in Palestine and in Israel. So when I first landed in Israel and then traveled into Jerusalem and then on to the West Bank, one of the first things that stuck out to me was the very complicated identification system imposed on the Palestinians, which make living a normal life pretty difficult. So I'm going to do my best to explain this to you, but it's pretty complicated. So you're going to hopefully stick with me. I'm going to do my best. So we're going to start off with license plates and segregated roads. This is the first thing one notices when they travel into the region. You'll notice that license plates vary in color. So there's two different ones. There's ones for Israelis and there's ones for Palestinians. Now remember, the entire region of Israel is very small. So you can travel easily within hours throughout the entire country. So you're seeing these different license plates as you travel around, as you go in and out of the West Bank, into the Israel side, into the West Bank side. Yellow and black is for Israeli, green and white is for Palestinian. Now, all throughout the West Bank, well, for one, green and white license plates are not allowed into Israel at all. So you cannot take a green and white registered vehicle, a Palestinian registered vehicle, into Israel. However, Israelis can travel into the West Bank with their yellow and black license plates. And there are many roads throughout the West Bank that are segregated. You cannot drive on those roads unless you have a yellow and black license plate. So if you are a Palestinian with a Palestinian registered car, you're not allowed on these roads, even though these roads are inside the West Bank, which is supposed to be Palestinian territory, but as we know, it's heavily occupied by the Israelis. There's hundreds of settlements that are built throughout the West Bank. And Israelis say the reason why they built these roads is to make life easier for the Israeli settlers that are living in these settlements, because there are about 140 checkpoints throughout the West Bank that Palestinians are subjected to. They've got to go through these checkpoints, and oftentimes it's very disruptive to their lives. They're very slow. They can take hours on end. Sometimes the checkpoints are closed down. Sometimes the checkpoints don't exist. Sometimes they pop up, they disappear, then they pop back up. And this leads to a delay. It's a traffic jam for the Palestinians. Well, in order for the Israeli settlers to avoid those traffic jams, they built themselves separate roads all throughout the West Bank. And only Israelis are allowed on those roads. Now, there is a misconception that these roads are Jewish only. That's not the case. Anybody who is Israeli, including Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, they are allowed to drive on those roads. So as long as you're an Israeli citizen or an American citizen renting an Israeli car, because you're allowed to do that, and you have an Israeli car with a yellow and black license plate, you're allowed on those special roads that are segregated and all throughout the West Bank. So that is one of the first things that one notices when traveling into the area, the segregated roads and the fact that Palestinians are subjected to these extremely long, cumbersome, and worrisome checkpoints. I mean, imagine one of the problems with the checkpoints is, let's say you're on your way to a wedding or to a doctor's appointment or just to work and school, and you have to cross through one of these many 140 checkpoints all throughout the West Bank. If you're crossing those and the Israelis feel like there's some kind of security threat, and what normally takes you 45 minutes to get through a checkpoint, instead now it's closed and you're not able to get to your destination, or it's backlogged and you're looking at 4 hours to get through. This makes life extremely worrisome and difficult for Palestinians because the checkpoints are often shut down or they're often taking much longer than normal. So a Palestinian living just a normal life, trying to get to and from work, trying to get to and from school, it's very, very difficult. Those who are really needing to go somewhere like a wedding or to a doctor's appointment, they have to plan their lives to where, like the average person like myself, if my doctor's office is 30 minutes away, then I leave 30 minutes from now to get to my doctor's office. A Palestinian, on the other hand, has to take into consideration that the checkpoint they need to go through might be closed or might be delayed. And so they have to go to their destination hours and hours and hours in advance. If it's a special occasion, especially like a wedding or a doctor's appointment, they've got to plan that out way in advance. So it's extremely disruptive to their lives that they have these checkpoints all throughout the West Bank. Now, these checkpoints don't only exist. One would think, well, okay, maybe you have to go through a checkpoint if you're going from Palestine into Israel, right? That makes sense. It's border security. But that's not what's happening over there. What's happening is these checkpoints are all throughout the West Bank, dotted around just anywhere Palestinians want to go. So if they're traveling from one Palestinian town to another Palestinian town and they're not going anywhere near the Israeli border, there's still a checkpoint they have to go through. So that is one of the first things you notice, of course, are the roads, the traveling, the segregation, and the checkpoints that Palestinians are subjected to, very disruptive to their lives. Another thing that becomes apparent is when you're traveling into the areas A, and which now I realize I need to describe areas A, B, and C to you. But when you travel into Area A, now Area A is Palestinian-controlled area. So this was something that went back to the Oslo Accords, where when they were trying to make peace in the region, what they did was they gave the Palestinian Authority control over areas A. They gave joint control to Israelis and the Palestinian Authority in areas B. And area C is full Israeli control. It's occupied by military, and the Israeli Defense Forces control and secure or monitor, whatever you want to call it, that area. Now, area C makes up about 60 to 70% of the West Bank. It's the rural kind of outskirts, the farmland. And this is also the area where all of the settlements are built. So area C is controlled by the Israelis. They've allowed these settlements to pop up on these lands, and obviously causing a lot of contention and strife for the Palestinians. Areas B are jointly controlled. So you would say these are sort of the suburb areas of the main villages and towns and cities that the Palestinians live in. And areas A are where Palestinians are in higher, densely populated areas. So these are their concentrated areas, cities and towns and villages. That is what Area A is. So, and we will get into in future segments the issues surrounding areas A, B, and C, because there's a lot of issues about building permits, expansion, and there's a lot there. So that's in a different segment. But for this, you fundamentally understand that Area A, there are no Israeli soldiers inside areas A. This is controlled and secured and patrolled by the Palestinians, by the Palestinian Authority only. So Area B is joint and Area C is only Israeli. Now, there are these red signs when you're traveling on the freeways, on the highways, getting in, all throughout the West Bank. Any road that leads to an Area A, for the most part, this road is going to contain these big red signs. And the big red signs say, this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against Israeli law. Very scary. So this is one of the problems with the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, is that there's a lot of fear going on where Israelis are basically told these Palestinians are going to kill you if you go into their region, that these Palestinians are dangerous, they're animals. It's almost like, oh my gosh, you're heading into Jurassic Park. You never know. These Palestinians are going to get you, with these giant red signs telling you, stay away, your life is dependent on it. These people are dangerous. That feeds into the mentality that Palestinians are terrorists, that these Palestinians are you go in there and they're going to get you. Now, there is no doubt that there is a lot of tension between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that many Palestinians, especially the youth, when they see an Israeli face, they see an oppressor. They see somebody who is making their lives miserable. They see somebody who is against them. So there is a lot of tension. There is a lot of violence. It is dangerous for some Israelis to travel into those areas. But they really mean when they have these signs up there, they mean it's they mean it for Jewish Israelis only. They're not meaning this for the Arab Israelis, and it's rarely enforced. So there are times when you've got pretty contentious, violent, sort of extremist Israelis that will travel into these areas, and they will attack the Palestinians. And so there's a lot of tension, and a lot of that tension has to do with these red signs that are out there just basically telling everybody that everybody's an enemy. It's not helpful. So you see these red signs everywhere all throughout the West Bank leading into any of the Palestinian areas. Now imagine that as a Palestinian. This land is supposed to be yours. It's the West Bank. That is your designated area according to international law. And throughout your designated area, you've got roads you're not allowed to be on. And all along other roads, you've got signs that are telling people to stay away from you because you're dangerous. This is psychologically very damaging to the Palestinians, and it's definitely not leading to peace. Now let's talk about the identification system. Now this is where things get pretty rough. There are green and blue IDs. This is the basic, green and blue. Now there are different types of green and different types of blue, but blue is for all Israeli citizens. It's what they carry. It's their passport, right? Blue indicates for Israeli, and blue also indicates Palestinians living in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is under Israeli annexation. So Jerusalemites is what they're called, and Israelis all get blue identifications, but they get different ones from one another. Now, green is for people living in Gaza and people living in the West Bank. And again, they're two separate different IDs, but they're both green. So blue, if you're an Israeli citizen, you have free reign. You can travel anywhere. You can go anywhere throughout the West Bank, except into those areas A where there's those big red signs. You're allowed to go to obviously all throughout Israel. You're able to go anywhere throughout Jerusalem, and you can fly in and out of Tel Aviv. You have full freedom of movement minus those areas A. Of course, however, if you're, that's basically it. So if you're an Arab Israeli, then you really have free reign because you're able to go, if you're one of those minorities, then you're able to go anywhere, including into those area A's without fear and without anybody stopping you. However, those blue identifications for Israelis do have a different numbering system and do indicate those who are Arab Israelis. So Arab Israelis have a different set of rules. There's a bit of segregation going on the Israeli side of the wall, and Arab Israelis are treated a bit differently than Jewish Israelis, or even Bedouin Israelis, and there's other minority groups inside of Israel, but Arab Israelis are given a separate identification. Once somebody's looking at it, they know this person is Arab. Because one thing to also know about the region is Palestinians and Israelis don't look all that different. There are many that look very, very similar, and it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. There are very light-colored Palestinians with blue eyes and blonde hair, or very light hair with very pale skin. That's pretty common in Palestine. It's also common in Israel. There are dark Israelis. There are black Israelis, and the same thing over on the Palestinian side. So you can't tell what a person is based on looking at them over there. It's way more complex than that. So the green cards, the green identification. People in Gaza have a green ID that is indicating that they're Gazian. They're really extremely restricted. They can't go anywhere. If you're Gazian, you're stuck. You are in Gaza. You cannot leave. They technically have a system of you can apply and ask for permission to leave for some reason, but it's extremely difficult to get out of Gaza. It's also extremely difficult to get into Gaza. Again, you need to have special permission. You not only need to get permission from the Israelis, but you also need to get permission from Hamas, which is the governing body of Gaza. And Hamas also controls people going out and coming in, and they're not allowed to go into Egypt at all, and they're really, really stuck. Now, West Bank Palestinians, they also have a green ID, but the green ID indicates that they are in the West Bank, that they're in Palestine. These people are not able to go to, they're only allowed to travel inside the West Bank. Now, they can go to Gaza with special permission, but again, it's very, very difficult. Usually, the only people from the West Bank who are allowed to get permission into Gaza are people with first degree relatives in Gaza, typically former Gazans that used to live there and then they left, and they're allowed to go in for special circumstances. But people in the West Bank, they're not allowed to travel anywhere in Jerusalem. They cannot use the Tel Aviv airport. They're not allowed to even go into Jerusalem. They are only allowed to stay in the West Bank. And if they want to fly in and out and go anywhere around the world, they've got to go into Jordan. So now this is where it gets really complex. And this is where it gets really, really challenging for people. So let's say you're from Jerusalem. Now, East Jerusalem is filled with Palestinians, but it's under annexation of Israel. So the Jerusalemites, if you're a Jerusalemite and you want to go to college, you're probably going to go to college in Ramallah, which is inside the West Bank. So let's say you're a college student, you go to Ramallah, and you're a young man from Jerusalem, your family's in Jerusalem, your parents, and you meet a nice girl in Ramallah, and she's from, let's say, Bethlehem. And you fall in love and you want to marry her. Well, even though the cities are really close to one another, everybody's in fairly close proximity, this young girl from Bethlehem is not able to move with you to Jerusalem. It's not allowed. Your only option is to move into Bethlehem or anywhere else in the West Bank with her, because she's not allowed into Jerusalem, even though East Jerusalem is technically, according to international law, it belongs to the Palestinians. The Israelis have annexed it and they control it, and they don't allow Palestinians to immigrate into it, but they do let you leave. So this young man would have to move into the West Bank. If he does this, he loses his Jerusalemite identification, which means he loses his freedom of movement. So then, right now, as a Jerusalemite, he's able to travel anywhere in Israel, anywhere in Jerusalem, anywhere in the West Bank, and he can fly out of Tel Aviv. However, once he decides to move to Bethlehem or Ramallah or wherever with this young girl, he gives all that up, including his ability to visit his own parents. This is where it creates family separation. Now this young man has to decide between his parents, who are inevitably going to age and need his help, or the love of his life, who he wants to make a family with. And this is a very common issue with Palestinians living in that region. So if he leaves and he goes, then the only way he can see his parents are if his parents travel into the West Bank to visit. But he's not allowed to go back into Jerusalem to see his own home, to visit his own neighborhood, and to see his own parents without special permission. So if he leaves and gives up his Jerusalemite identification and gets the green ID rather than the blue ID, he's going to have to ask the Israelis for special permission to visit his own home that he was born and raised, and to visit his own parents. This creates immense strife, immense confusion and complication for the Palestinians, and it's by design. The idea really is that the Israelis have a desire to completely overtake Jerusalem, and they'd rather the Palestinians leave. It kind of makes it to where many Palestinians living in Jerusalem, when some of their family members have to move and live outside of Jerusalem, it makes many of them say, you know what, life's just easier if we move along with them. So it gets those older people out of Jerusalem and into the West Bank so that their homes can then be sold to others to take over, so to Israelis, for them to take over the region. That is really the purpose of it. So this creates a lot of issues and a lot of strife. Now, people that are living in the West Bank with the green passport, with the green identification, so the passports is where things get really tricky too. Most people living in the West Bank are issued Jordanian passports. So the country of Jordan will give Palestinians a temporary passport from their nation in order to allow the Palestinians to travel throughout the world. The reason is because Palestinians, they're greatly helped by the Jordanians, but also they use the Jordanian airport to get in and out. They're not allowed into Tel Aviv. They've got to go through to Jordan. This creates a huge amount of complication for them to travel out of the country, because they've got to go through Palestinian border control, They got to go through Israeli border control because the Israelis control the border. Even though the West Bank borders Jordan, the Israelis actually control that border. So they got to go through first the Palestinians, which is fairly simple for them. Then they got to go through the Israelis, which is not so simple. And then they got to go through Jordan, through their border security, which is fairly normal. So it takes a person who wants to travel out of the Jordan airport, which would normally should only take a couple of hours. It takes something like 12 hours to 14 hours to get in and out of that airport. So those who carry the green, they're only allowed to fly out of Jordan. They're not allowed to fly out of Tel Aviv. Those who carry the blue are able to fly out of Tel Aviv. But the problem is with those who are the Jerusalemites. So they have freedom of movement all throughout Israel, all throughout the West Bank. They can pretty much go anywhere, but it gets really complicated when they want to leave the country because they're not under the Palestinian Authority, which has the deal with the Jordanian government to give them Jordanian passports, but they're also not Israeli citizens. They're actually given Israeli permanent residency in Jerusalem. So imagine this, you were born and raised and your family goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Your family's lineage has been in Jerusalem forever and ever and ever. And meanwhile, you're not considered a citizen of any nation. You're stateless. You're actually considered just a permanent resident, and you're given essentially a green card to live in where your family has been for hundreds of years. So their lives are a little bit more complicated when they want to leave the country because they're not issued. Some of them are issued Jordanian passports, so they do end up working with the Palestinian Authority and with the Jordanian government in order to be issued a Jordanian passport. Some of them do attempt and are granted Israeli citizenship, so not many. Last year, I believe that the Israelis did grant citizenship to about 1,400 East Jerusalemites, but many are rejected, and it leaves these stateless people in this sort of limbo when they want to leave the country. A lot of them are granted sort of travel documents. They're not issued passports. They have to go through then kind of like a rigmarole when they want to go and travel to, let's say, England or Germany or the United States, and they have to get permission from that country in order to get in without the passport with this kind of weird travel document. And a lot of times those countries find them threatening because they're like, yeah, but you're stateless, so you might come here seeking asylum, which is a problem for us. We don't really want all these asylum seekers from Jerusalem. And so it creates this confusion, this extra layer of hassle for these Jerusalemites who are just trying to travel the world. So that is the complicated and intricate identification system. Now, the most important thing to note is that it is required of every Palestinian to carry around this identification at all times. They cannot be caught without their ID indicating that they are Palestinian and what kind of Palestinian and where does this Palestinian belong. They must have this identification at all times. Let that sink in for just a second. So that is a general overview of this complicated system. It's actually a bit more complicated. There's more layers to it. There are Jewish Palestinians living in the West Bank that are they're Palestinian descent, but they live on the West Bank, but they happen to be Jewish in religion. So there's some complication there. There's also complication for American citizens who are trying to immigrate into the West Bank and build up the West Bank. These are Americans who maybe immigrated they're Palestinians who maybe immigrated to the United States in the 60s, and they tried to come back during the Oslo Accords to help build up the country, or it's the children of those people, and they're there running businesses. They're under a very complicated identification system as well, where their travel is also limited once the Israelis find out that they're Palestinian descent living in the West Bank. Even though they're Americans, even though they're paying tax dollars to the Israelis, they're still restricted. They're given a visa that says Judea and Samaria only, meaning they're not allowed to travel into even Jerusalem or into Israel. They're not allowed to go anywhere. They do get a special provision where they're allowed to fly in and out of Tel Aviv when they leave the country. So they get a little bit of a better situation than those carrying the green identification. But even American citizens who are Palestinian are treated with discrimination or this lack of freedom of movement, this lack of, this restriction. Even Americans are subjected to this when the Israelis find out that they're Palestinians trying to help build up the West Bank. So hopefully that, it is more complicated, like I said, but this was a general overview. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell. This is one of many that are going to be rolling out this week. Palestinian lives are in danger. Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he plans to annex the Jordan Valley this coming Wednesday. And that would cut the Palestinians off from their Jordanian border, the Jordan River, which is their water source, and also take about a third of their agricultural land. It is an illegal annexation. The world is against it. But when does that seem to matter, unfortunately, at times? So we are shedding light on what life is like as a Palestinian under occupation. Thank you for watching this series. Thank you for supporting the channel. All of the links to any of the videos that are connected to this series are going to be linked down below, so please be on the lookout. Thank you again for watching.